thank you for making time to speak with me, Olivia.
Yeah.
Under normal circumstances, ACE would have had you in Adelaide to talk in person, but given where we're at now, we'll make do with a virtual chat. So thank you for making time. I thought I'd just, for the benefit of people listening to this, I thought I'd give some background to ACE's invitation to you to curate Recess Presents. Since I started at ACE Open last year, I'd been thinking a bit about video practitioners in Australia, especially emerging and experimental practices. So I've been thinking about the lack of scholarship about emerging and experimental video practitioners in Australia, and that there'd been no sort of cohesive understanding at an institutional level about what was happening, because I had seeing a lot of practitioners working in various ways in that medium. And I'd also been following Recess closely for the last few years, and it seemed to be the most, from my research and viewing, the most concise sort of bringing together those practitioners. And in particular, I really thought a focus on new voices. And in that I mean, really thinking about race, sexuality, identity, and more generally, not exclusively, but there were certain elements of, like, particularly using a diaristic account, that were drawing out just a new generation and how they were thinking about the world, or how they were seeing the world. And video is a great medium in order to pull that out as well. So this led me to invite you last year, I think in December, to curate a show with ACE. From my end, it was a really open invitation, because I was interested in further exploring and learning about video practitioners, and wanting to see where you take the invitation and who you might bring into the show. For more context, earlier this year, I think just as we were about to go into the final stages of development and realising the project, we were faced with coronavirus. So we talked a bit about how we might pivot the show and continue to invest in the work that you'd already selected. And given that they're all video works that lend themselves to an online forum, and obviously Recess has been working in that space for a while, it was possible to shift the show back again into a virtual space on a purpose-built website. So I think that's important for what you've done, or how you've worked with ACE, is that the content lended itself to an online platform rather than trying to squeeze it into that space. So Recess has been around since 2016. Can you tell me a little bit about Recess as an online project / platform, and why you founded it?
So Recess came out of a particular time, I guess I could say, economy in the Melbourne art scene, where, like, artist-run spaces that often hosted emerging artists were charging rent. They had to pay rent, so they were charging artists to rent gallery spaces, and it wasn't necessarily an affordable model for artists to exhibit their works. And at the same time, there was quite a surge or a popularity in having video works in gallery exhibitions.
Having to pay for exhibition space, but also not seeing video practice explored in more artist-run spaces.
Yeah, there were a lot of video works being shown, but maybe in group contexts where you'd have different mediums, and then also like a video work amongst sculpture or performance. And because it has a particular relationship to time, especially narrative videos, sometimes I felt that those videos were being overlooked in those spaces, or were awkwardly fitting in a gallery space. So that was the impetus to put everything online, or to put exhibitions online. And it also, with this affordability, basically just paying the domain, not being able to pay artists, unfortunately, or ourselves, but it just took the pressure off those upfront payments, and then having the artists able to show works that maybe weren't finalised or saleable artworks, kind of took that economic pressure off. So we could show drafts, or we could show older works, and there was less of a formulated pressure. It could just be focusing on what the artist was interested in.
And I think, would it be right to say, like, and it was certain for me as a viewer with Recess, that it then puts into focus more that the video practice or the video content as well, because he's saying is when you can see that in a group, you know, it's not isolated, you're seeing it in a group context. With other materialities, it kind of like, I found viewing it through the screen actually and in the laptop format a really, and, you know, being able to watch videos that were hosted on Recess Presents multiple times, and you know, and videos that were that are leading into like online formats like Instagram or you know, YouTube personality videos, like a natural fit in many ways, and also a forum to, as a viewer, to like learn more about the practice, being able to like, I guess time is that sort of time-based viewing practice. I feel like Recess opened that space up as well.
Yeah, and I guess in that sense, in a broad sense, it could lend to the artist's portfolio, and make, you know, often we read about artists' works in the abstract or in a biography, but we can't see them and it's hard to understand. So then it becomes, the site often archives the works, and then it becomes a tool. So people can, view the works multiple times, or use it as like an informal educational tool. Like a few friends have used it in crits in art schools and stuff like that, just to show young artists like what's out there.
Yeah.
And it was also co-organised by Kate Meakin and Nina Gilbert, and Kate came up with the idea to have the archive and also to have written responses to the works, and that also became like a central organising thing of the website, where we would organise for the writer and the artist to meet or to chat in some way, and then a writer would respond to the work. And I think that opened up the discussion a bit, and often the texts are quite creative and maybe non-fictional, or sometimes the reviews, but I guess it just gives focus and attention to that artwork, rather than walking through a gallery and maybe picking up an exhibition catalogue and maybe reading it or not.
Like you mentioned in your curator's introduction to the Recess Presents project, that there's been a lack of inquiry by Australian galleries or institutions into experimental video as a medium. I wondered if you could just expand on why you think that might be the case.
It's a broad statement, but I guess video is really popular and moving image works are really visible in galleries now. But not particularly, like there aren't particularly shows that focus just on video. They're often incorporated as part of group shows or things like that. As we talked about, just this like awkward space that, and time-based space that like some narrative videos can like navigate in a gallery setting. I think that aspect of video works or moving image works is often overlooked in galleries or institutions. And it's great when there are moving image shows that are just focusing on film or video, but often they have so much at once and it's like over 20 hours running time, and then you go in and it's like so overwhelming to just watch things in one space. And it would be great if there was a library or something that you could go and see, but often those shows run for 2 or 3 weeks and then it's over. So I think that's what I meant about just looking at it really specifically.
I just thought it's timely to ask how the show has developed online, and also just more broadly what digital's meant during sort of lockdown or out of our usual habits. So essentially we've heard a lot about the possibility for connection across the digital realm at this time, as well as a sense of like screen fatigue. So, you know, through Recess, you've been working in this space for longer than and this year, and I just wonder what your thoughts about this new normal for art and artists are.
Well, as you mentioned before, we'd intended for this show to be in a gallery, and that was going to be a whole new set of sort of challenges for me as someone who'd organised video works online, but it is just luckily the exhibition lended itself to go back online. And on the screen fatigue, like I think a lot of people are over watching stuff online at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see if we're lucky enough with restrictions changing and ending in Australia, what it means, what this time has meant for future online exhibitions, or how galleries will navigate like online exhibitions versus like being in a gallery or being by appointment for shows. Yeah, it hasn't really changed a lot of, I guess we're kind of, the website is really basic that we usually run, not the one that ACE has helped us set up, but just the recess.net.au. It's about sort of affordability and simplicity, so it's just meant to sort of sit there as an archive. So we'll just keep running that, and I guess the whole like the theory or the idea concept behind Recess is the word is kind of like a pause in time, but also like a secluded space. So the idea is that the website is like kind of like a sheltered space for artists to kind of regroup or to hold sort of one-off things. Yeah.
The other thing I mentioned too is that we haven't talked about that, but the intended physical gallery show with ACE is not the first time like Recess has expanded beyond its online platform. That you have done presentations in different formats for festivals and other galleries. For my part, it's a nice way to think like Recess as a platform is saying like a sheltered space, or its intent about what it gives to artists and the way that their work is viewed or privileged. That's not just about one format for viewing, it's about the contextualization and dissemination of the work as well.
Yeah, it's kind of adaptable. An adaptable platform. And I'd like to mention that we haven't ever received any kind of government funding, and that, you know, a lot of our screenings and stuff and this show ACE is like supported financially. So so we're supported financially by ACE, and in the past we've been supported financially or in terms of like given spaces or access to equipment by like Outer Space Galleries, which is an RE in Brisbane, and Artist Film Workshop, which runs in Melbourne. So just, I guess, like using opportunities that our community creates for us, and also using our networks. So I had a Filipino friend who's a filmmaker happened to come by Australia, and I asked him to screen his works and do like an informal chat with us. And, you know, so just when opportunities come up, that's a way to facilitate things.
Should we turn more to the content of the exhibition, the content of the exhibition? So the exhibition includes a wide array of approaches to video making. You know, I'll note found CCTV footage, sitcom formats, animation, non-narratives. So I just thought, can you describe in more detail how some of the artists in Recess Presents are experimenting materially with videos as both a medium and also a storytelling device? So I think there's medium, but there's also the different ways of communicating that happen as a result.
So the experimental approaches to the medium were definitely influential in selecting different works that sort of use different techniques that viewers aren't used to. One of these works is Heroes by Aaron Claringbold and Rebecca Macaulay. The video is mainly comprised of video footage that's taken from, they say, the artists say, unsecured CCTV footage that's looking out into the Echuca River in a Yorta Yorta area of land and water. The footage is then sort of replayed on their laptop, and the video is a kind of screen recording of selected clips, if that makes sense, from their laptop. That work is really sort of linking in with surveillance and changing that idea of like an artist holding a camera and positioning shots or like framing things to be quite responsive to, you know, current technologies and how they're used in the world, like security cameras, but also looking out onto a natural landscape in Australia during the sort of Australia Day or Invasion Day long weekend of the 26th of January. And basically turning the surveillance into looking at people celebrating on the river, presumably Australian citizens. And another experimental aspect of that work, which is really strong, is they've used underwater recordings of marine vessels, and that just sits sort of at a low register throughout the whole video, and that kind of affects, to me it really affects the tone of the video and what the visuals mean, and that kind of explores their position on nationalism and who celebrates what, using experimental techniques. So in another work, Odzim, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, by Avni Doughty and Rebecca Vaughan. They've created a computer-generated visual space. I wouldn't really call it an animation, but I guess a fictional space that's not an IRL recording. And they've sort of also generated objects of this museum and used found footage to kind of critique autism, which is the discrimination against the deaf. So it's kind of a fake history museum, if you like. But the artists say that the video space is sort of propositional, and it's not purely for the use of critiquing autism. Like, the work isn't purely a critique, it's also a space where alternate histories can exist. And I guess it's a propositional space because you could explore other things there. And that's another example where the technique, like the visual techniques and experimentation, is really like the base of the work. Yeah,
in your curator's introduction, you've outlined that there's two distinct groupings or thematics that sort of underpin or an undercurrent in the grouping of the 10 works in Recess Presents. And I'll quote you around the first grouping, which is drawn from urban and regional areas that make up contemporary Australia. The first grouping focuses on artists' relationship to land and demonstrates video's ability to adapt and tell stories from diverse locations and histories. So I thought it'd be nice to hear a little bit more about that thematic and how that's come about. And personally for me, I'm especially interested here in the diversity of perspectives that make up this grouping, both geographically and biographically, and this critiquing of nationhood that comes out from that diversity of points of reference. Yeah.
So one example of this first group of works is Nuncio Madden's work Bushduff, which was actually made before this exhibition, but then certain parts were added onto it, like a second part. So the artist returns to their hometown, you could say, of Whittlesea in Victoria, and it's sort of a handheld shots with iPhone footage of the Whittlesea Fair. So something that the artist grew up with and has experienced many times, but sort of the emphasis is definitely on a return to that place as an adult. And just there's an interesting tension between being an insider, like being familiar with that place, and also being an outsider, like not belonging necessarily to that, the mainstream in that area, or that culture and looking in on it and recording like they're called wood chopping competitions and like cake making competitions and just like the undertones of the culture of that place. And then there's other works by James Newen, who often uses like a kind of collaborative model with his parents or family, and speaking in Vietnamese, they retell the story of Australian nationalistic fairy tale or children's book called The Magic Pudding. They're kind of retelling the story from their perspectives, and they interject they go from storytelling to interjecting objective critiques. They kind of break the fourth wall a lot. They're kind of moving in and out of narrative modes. That idea of nationhood is kind of critiqued both in those works and their relationship to place. This James's video takes place outside, sort of in the bush, in an unspecified location, but very much adds to the video.
I do like that idea of insider outsider. That's a nice way to put it with this grouping.
Yeah, I think that really comes out, especially in Nuncio's work, or even James in the way that he moves in and out of modes. Yeah.
So thank you, Olivia. So the second grouping is artists looking to archives, found footage and digital media to integrate systems of power that shape identity and perception. And you say that in this second grouping of video works, the artist's subjectivity is a filter and the camera is a tool of analysis. So we want to just speak to some of the works in this grouping. Personally, I'm especially interested here in how video can be a tool to raise the visibility of marginalised identities. Like, you might want to challenge that idea, but I do think there is something about who gets to speak and how they get to speak that is part of this thematic.
Yeah, definitely the works, in both sections, but also in the second sort of grouping, play with the idea of marginality. And talking about marginalised identities, I think it's just easier to talk about in terms of like being on the margins. So like visually on a sheet of paper, you have the main story and then what's on the side of that. And I think like the show offers a space for artists that are already working on sort of like talking away from a mainstream. For example, Martine Sim's work is called A Pilot for a Show About Nowhere, which kind of encapsulates what the video is about. So she uses a lot of sitcoms that represent African American people and kind of looks to the depiction of the history of the depiction of her and people in mainstream media. But then the actual video doesn't follow like a very tight linear structure, and it's more meandering, and it focuses on her as a subject and explores like multiple points of views, screenshots, looking at her phone, looking out onto the street. There's not a very clear sense of like what's going on, and there's also not a very clear sense of like this is what it means to be Black or something like that. So in America. So yeah, and also with like Liang Loscombe's work, she's like depicted these whole kind of fictional worlds through script, props and like set making, but they're kind of like a bit schlocky, or like there's something sort of uncouth about them. And I guess on the piece of paper there'd be like Hollywood, and then for Liang's work it's sort of about taking apart like classic scripts where Asian American women are depicted, or Asian women are depicted in Hollywood, and deconstructing those lines or those spaces, and interjecting all this humour constantly in between them.
And you have the artist speaking to camera in that one in a very interesting way, I find, as well, as the narrator.
Yeah, the artist kind of takes over the role of a kind of authoritative narrator
Yeah.
that's sort of highly like corny
Yeah.
and zany, and it's quite unsettling and really makes you think about what kind of authoritative voices that we rely on when we're told like stories,
Yeah,
like visually, like in film.
and even that shifting in gaze, or like speaking direct to camera and breaking that I guess archetype as well through that means.
Yeah, and literally having hands moving and filters, people holding props,
Yeah.
kind of like intervening in the space.
Yeah.
Just completely changes it.
Yeah.
Grace Herbert made a work called Now That the Journey is Over, I Don't Want Any Trouble to Begin. And it was sort of, a lot of the footage was shot on a residency in Georgia, in Tbilisi in Georgia, in Eastern Europe. Another example of like the mainstream is that Grace engaged with a YouTube artist in Georgia. So talking about like YouTube is a very accessible medium. But this artist was actually documenting via drone the removal of ancient trees. So 100-year-old trees were being removed for sale. And Grace uses this footage as found footage as like a main part of her video work, and also stalks a very rich president of that country who has like a murky relationship with the kind of environmental politics of the space, and what he promised the country, and then like personal wealth. So yeah, that's another example of kind of drawing out like mainstream political issues and then finding niches where the artist has like reevaluated what those mediums are, what like access to YouTube means for like what's going on under capitalism.
Just to make it like for anyone that's been watching Recess Presents online, the format is that there's 10 selected videos. One is released each week, lives online for 2 weeks. So you have this sort of 2 works at a time that you can view online, and that shifts as we go. And so, you know, personally as a viewer watching that, there seems to be something distinct with the sequential thematics that are unfolding in this way. And it's obviously different to being in a gallery and having things that you see in space and time en masse at the same time. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you've, as the curator, found this format, what your thoughts are about this format and what it's doing, or if you've learned anything through it. And I'd also say one of the things that we've added into this online website format that we weren't in the gallery form is having the a written text, a newly written text sit alongside each video. So it's, and again, it's similar to what Recess does in that the responses are very varied, they're experimental, they might be academic. So it adds this other dimension to the work and how it lives online or reads, I feel, when you look at the website. So I just keen to hear your perspective or take about what you've learning or how you've felt it builds a cohesive whole in this format.
Yeah, I think thinking about online, the online world as a space has informed the show, and especially thinking about how it was going to be presented in a space. And we had a few talks about that, and just trying to keep the show to be not just a repeat of like the Recess online program normally, but to sort of make it more of an exhibition and more focused. But yeah, I think I'm really happy that we decided to sort of separate the works out for a longer period. I think that just talking about like screen fatigue and everything, it gives people more time to access the works. And then also I think the nice thing is they kind of, instead of being seen individually or being seen all at the same time in one space, they can kind of, the videos inform each other differently. So I might watch something in a few weeks' time and think back to what played at the beginning, and I guess it changes that relationship between works, and gives the viewer a bit more agency about like what the connections are in the show.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. I was even thinking about like when the first video was Nunzio's Bushstuff, and then you go to James Newen's Magic Pudding, and there's so much about family relationships and conception of self through those family relations that perhaps I wouldn't have got if I'd seen it in the gallery in that same format. Like I wouldn't have made that connection between those two works as immediately as I did in the way that it's unfolded.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have thought of that either. So it's great that those elements can just occur like holistically, and that associations can be a bit more broad rather than really directed.
Yeah, which is what you say in your introduction as well about this sort of I don't know, the twirling or the constant movement for like constant shifting of movement in the relationships between each work.
And I think that's a really good point about like just how we pause things that we're watching on our laptops and we walk away, like life kind of comes in and out, or connections are lost like online, and like the show then can be more like that rather than like let's go to the movies and like sit here for a few hours, which can also be great, but just being more realistic about what like that space is for people. And the writers were just like a great addition, I think, to the online program, because a lot more about the work can be explored and given attention to. There's a writing by Tristan Harwood that is talking about the woman artist's work that are animated paintings, and it just gives the viewer more of a background of the East Kimberley painting tradition, as well as having a personal involvement or response to those works. Another example is just Miriam McGarry's response to Grace Herbert's work, again, which just opens up more about the political situation in Georgia and the complicity of the president there, that maybe would be not accessible just walking through and seeing that work in a gallery. And also the fact that the writer's works are archived on the site means that it'll exist longer than the show.
Yeah.
And that's another kind of tool or way that the show can exist.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your times with me today, as well as bringing together such a thoughtful and diverse mix of works and being and adapting so thoughtfully the project from a gallery show into this online format. So thank you, Olivia.
Thanks.